October 12th, 1973. London, the Langham Hotel. Fog rolled low along Portland Place that night, coiling around the street lamps in pale ribbons. The Langham stood as it always had since 1865, stately, magnificent, its pale facade rising through the mist like a ghost of itself. The revolving doors turned quietly, whispering guests in and out. Inside, everything gleamed. Chandeliers like constellations, polished marble floors that carried the weight of centuries, and a silence that somehow felt deliberate. The kind of silence that waits for something. That evening, the BBC had rented several rooms for visiting journalists. One of them, a man named Peter Wilcox, was assigned to room 33. He was 43, practical, skeptical of the supernatural. He had spent his career dissecting news, not chasing phantoms. When the receptionist offered him the key, she paused a moment too long before saying the number aloud. He laughed. "I don't believe in that nonsense," he said. The receptionist smiled thinly. "Of course not, sir." The room was beautiful, almost indulgently so. High ceilings, damask curtains, a brass bed heavy enough to survive a war. The lamps glowed warm gold, reflecting in the long mirror by the writing desk. Nothing felt strange at first. Peter unpacked his suitcase, loosened his tie, and stood by the window looking down at the blurred red lights of London taxis crawling through the fog. It had been a long day. He was covering an international finance conference and had no patience left for legends. He ordered tea, wrote a few notes, and turned in just before midnight. The bed was softer than he expected, swallowing him in warmth. He left one lamp on, as he always did in hotel rooms. Not from fear, but habit. He drifted towards sleep to the faint hum of the city beyond the glass. At 3:15 a.m. when he woke, he couldn't say why. There was no sound, no draft, just the sudden awareness of being awake, of the room breathing differently. The air felt thick, heavy, like velvet soaked in water. He blinked into the dimness. The lamp was still on, but the light had changed. It seemed weaker, yellowing, as though it were struggling against something unseen. Then he saw him, standing beside the bed. A man, pale as the fog outside, wearing a long black coat from another century. His hair was slicked back, his skin smooth and bloodless, and his eyes were nothing but black, bottomless wells that swallowed the light around them. Peter's breath caught in his throat. He tried to speak but found he couldn't. The man didn't move. He simply stood there, watching. The seconds stretched. The air seemed to hum. Then the man leaned forward. Peter could see the fine details, the high collar, the buttons, the faint shimmer of moisture at the corner of one eye, as though he were weeping. When he spoke, the voice was wrong. It didn't come from his mouth, but from somewhere behind Peter's own skull, low, whispering, rhythmic. It wasn't English. It wasn't anything he'd recognized. Peter tried to sit up, but his body refused. The invisible weight pressed down on his chest, forcing the air from his lungs. He felt a coldness seeping into him, not like the cold of weather, but of absence. The figure moved closer, bending until his face hovered inches from Peter's. The skin was grey, translucent. The eyes were pits. And then he smiled. It wasn't a human smile. Peter's vision blurred. He gasped, his body convulsing. The last thing he remembered before losing consciousness was the faint smell of earth and iron, as though the grave itself had opened. When he came to, it was morning. The lamp was off. His suitcase lay open, papers scattered across the floor. The air smelled faintly of smoke. Peter stumbled to his feet, drenched in sweat, His watch had stopped at exactly 3:33 a.m. He left the room without packing, without even putting on his shoes. The night porter watched him hurry through the lobby, tie hanging loose, eyes wild. "Sir, are you all right?" Peter didn't answer. He crossed the marble floor barefoot, pushed through the revolving doors, and disappeared into the mist. He never returned to the Langham. When his colleagues arrived later that day, they found his belongings untouched. Wallet, clothes, notebooks. The hotel staff had already sealed the room. The Langham has seen much in its 150 years. Royalty, scandals, even wartime occupation. But room 333 has always been its secret heart. There are stories that predate Peter's experience by nearly a century. In 1879, a doctor took his life there after murdering his wife and child in a fit of madness. Guests in the following years claimed to see him wandering the corridor, his face distorted, his nightshirt stained with blood. In 1936, an American soldier staying in 333 reported waking to find a man in a grey suit standing over him. The man's features were indistinct, his voice murmuring, "Go with me," again and again, until the soldier leapt from bed and fled into the hall. During the war, the hotel was converted into offices for the BBC. Staff working late claimed to hear someone pacing inside 333 long after it had been locked for the night. One woman said she heard a man crying softly behind the door. When she opened it, the room was empty, but the bed was still warm. After the war, room 333 was quietly renovated, its furniture replaced, wallpaper stripped, floors relaid. The management claimed it was simply aging infrastructure. But the pattern continued. Guests complained of vivid nightmares, of waking to find someone sitting at the foot of the bed. One man, a diplomat, said a visitor introduced himself as Mr. Fawcett. The hotel's records show that no such person had ever been registered, but an 1890s newspaper clipping mentions a guest by that name who died of a heart attack in that very room. Over the years, the hotel developed an unspoken policy. Room 333 was not to be given to single travelers, especially not men. The front desk would offer polite excuses. Under renovation, booked for maintenance. Still, sometimes the reservation system made a mistake. In 1964, a visiting actor from Los Angeles insisted on staying there, intrigued by the stories. That night, he told the bartender he would see for himself whether ghosts existed. The next morning, the chambermaid found his luggage outside the door, neatly stacked, as though he had moved out during the night. The bed was unmade. The window stood open to the freezing air. There were no footprints in the dust on the sill, but the curtain cords were twisted together, tied in a perfect knot. He never gave an interview about what happened. He simply said, "I don't sleep above the ground anymore." The Langham's management prefers not to speak of it, but some staff still tell the stories after hours, when the lights are low and the tourists gone. They say that on October nights, always October, the ghost returns. He comes when the moon is hidden, when the fog thickens outside, and the city seems to pause between breaths. He doesn't knock. He simply appears. Some describe him as a Victorian gentleman, others as something more decayed. But all agree on one detail. Their eyes, completely black, reflecting nothing. Guests who have seen him say that he does not always attack. Sometimes he only watches, standing perfectly still by the bed until dawn bleaches him from existence. Other times, he presses his weight on the sleeper's chest, his cold breath moving across their face. Those who wake under him describe a paralysis so total it feels like drowning. And then the whisper comes. Always the same sound. Soft, indecipherable syllables. Ancient and rhythmic. Those who hear it say it feels like a curse. There was a woman in the 1990s, an American writer researching paranormal folklore, who requested to spend a single night in room 333 for her book. The hotel hesitated, but she insisted. They let her sign a waiver. She brought a tape recorder, 2 cameras, and a notebook. At 2:59 a.m., the tape captured the sound of breathing. At 3:15, the recorder crackled with static. A low voice whispered what might have been her name. At 3:33, there was a long, drawn-out sigh. Not fear, not pain. Something else. Then nothing. She was found in the hallway at dawn, unconscious, her skin cold as stone. She recovered physically, but she never published her book. When asked about that night, she only said, "He spoke Latin, but not the Latin of men." Today, the Langham is still one of London's grandest hotels. Room 333 still exists, repainted, refurnished, renamed on digital maps as Room 332A, as if a number could change a truth. Guests pass it daily without a second thought. The door looks ordinary. The brass handle gleams. But those who work there say the temperature by that door is always lower than the rest of the corridor. The carpet never quite warms underfoot. Sometimes, late at night, when the hall is empty, the light outside the room flickers once, twice, then steadies. And if you put your ear to the door, which the staff strongly advise you not to do, you might hear the faintest sound. Not movement, not breath, whispering. A language that no one has ever been able to identify. Once, in 2012, a guest staying next door complained to reception about someone sobbing in the middle of the night. The night manager went up to check. The corridor was empty. When he reached the door to room 333, the sound stopped. He opened it. The room was unoccupied, freshly cleaned, untouched. Yet the impression of a body still lay visible in the sheets, as if someone had been sitting there moments before. He closed the door quietly and never went up again after midnight. Some legends say the ghost in room 333 was the doctor from 1879, trapped forever in the act of guilt. Others believe it's older still, a remnant of something the land itself remembers, a darkness that adopted the doctor's shape, using him like a mask. Whatever he is, he speaks rarely, but always between 3 and 4 in the morning, and always in a language that bends the ear, but never the mind, as if understanding it would be too much for the living. The Langham remains proud, elegant, lit from within. Its halls are full of laughter, its lobby hums with life. But somewhere above the chandeliers, and beneath the carpeted floors, the coldness waits. And if, one October night, you find yourself in that hotel, drifting towards sleep as the city's fog wraps around the windows, listen carefully. If you hear footsteps stop outside your door, and if the light beneath it dims, don't open your eyes, because he stands very close when he comes, and if he leans down and whispers to you in that language no one knows, you won't remember the words. You'll just remember that they weren't meant for the living. May 19th, 1536, the Tower of London. Dawn came grey and thin over the Thames, washing the tower's walls in a colour that wasn't quite light. The river carried the smell of salt and iron, and the courtyard below was still slick from the night's rain. It was the day chosen for execution, though no one spoke the word. The soldiers stood rigid in their armour. The spectators gathered like crows, and at the centre of it all, a young woman waited, hands folded, dressed in black silk that caught the morning wind. Anne Boleyn did not cry. They said her death would be quick, the king's special mercy, a sword from France instead of an axe. The executioner bowed to her before blindfolding her eyes. She whispered a prayer, small and shaking. The sound of it was almost drowned by the cawing of gulls circling overhead. Then the blade came down. The crowd gasped. A hush followed, deep and wrong, as though the air itself was stunned. For a moment, it seemed that the tower stopped breathing. And then the whisper began. Some said it was the wind through the battlements. Others said it was her. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell. The tower remained, its stone darkened by time, its moat long since drained. Tourists walked its grounds, laughing, pointing at the ravens. Guides told stories of treachery and kings, of secrets buried beneath the floorboards. But when the sun dipped below the horizon and the last gates clanged shut, the laughter vanished, and the tower became itself again, ancient, patient, and listening. The night guards know this better than anyone. They tell of footsteps echoing through the corridors long after the last tour has ended, of sudden drafts that smell faintly of roses, Anne's favourite perfume, of the feeling of being watched from windows where no one stands. But the most feared tale of all is the one that belongs to her, the Footless Lady. The first official report came in 1864. A sentry standing near the Salt Tower at 2 a.m. saw a figure gliding toward him down the corridor. She wore a long gown of faded blue, her hair twisted in a Tudor braid. Her face was pale, her eyes downcast. The guard raised his lantern. The light slid down her dress and stopped at her knees. There was nothing below. No feet, no shadow, just empty air. She floated closer, her eyes finally lifting to meet his. The guard screamed and fainted where he stood. When they found him, his uniform was drenched in sweat, his face frozen in terror. He described her voice as a whisper that wasn't a sound, but a thought forced into my head. They dismissed him, but within months, more sightings followed. By 1888, the story of the footless ghost had become part of the tower's legend. The night guards began to take the long way around certain halls, avoiding the upper gallery of the Chapel Royal. They claimed she appeared most often there, a woman in 16th century clothing, moving slowly as if in prayer. She never spoke. She only floated, her feet never touching the floor. Sometimes she carried something, a small object clasped in her hands. Those who saw it clearly wished they hadn't. It was her head. In 1915, during the First World War, 2 soldiers stationed at the tower were keeping watch near Traitor's Gate when they heard faint weeping. Thinking it was one of the prisoners being held for espionage, they followed the sound up the stone stairs. The weeping stopped abruptly. The air grew cold enough that they could see their breath. At the top of the stairs stood a woman. She wore no shoes. Her gown shimmered faintly, the colour of dusk. Her eyes were closed, but her mouth moved silently, as if repeating a prayer. When one of the soldiers called out to her, she lifted her head, and both men saw that she was holding something pale and round in her hands. Her own face, her own head. They fled, dropping their rifles. The official report filed the next morning called it an instance of shared hallucination induced by exhaustion. The tower, however, recorded the event in its own logbook. The entry remains to this day. Historians insist that Anne Boleyn's remains rest quietly in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, buried beneath the marble floor. But the yeoman warders, the tower's guards, say that her spirit still wanders, unable to rest, bound to the place of her death. One warder named Collins who served in the 1950s, told a BBC interviewer that he had encountered her twice. The first time he heard footsteps behind him, light, deliberate. When he turned, there was no one there. The second time, he saw her reflected in the glass of a display case. She was standing right behind him, eyes open, watching. She looked sad, he said, but not for herself, for me. Tourists occasionally report strange things too. Cameras malfunction inside the chapel. Photos develop with streaks of blue light. One visitor claimed to have felt a hand cold as ice rest on my shoulder while she was looking at the spot where Anne was executed. When she turned, there was no one near her. Some hear humming, soft, tuneless, like a lullaby sung through water. Others describe sudden bursts of scent, roses and candle smoke, that vanish as quickly as they appear. And then there are the whispers, faint female voices that seem to rise from the stones themselves. In 1972, a night god named David Sinclair was making his rounds when he noticed movement along the outer wall. It was after midnight. He assumed it was a trespasser and followed. The corridor ended at a dead wall of stone, and yet, from the shadows, a woman emerged. Her gown brushed the floor but made no sound. Her face was calm, her skin translucent, her feet were gone. The hem of her dress trailed into smoke. David froze, unable to move. The woman stopped in front of him. Her mouth opened slightly, and he felt, rather than heard, words poured into him. He didn't understand them. They weren't English, but their meaning was clear. Why did he do it? Then she passed through the wall, leaving behind the scent of roses. David left the tower the next day and never returned. In 1986, a tourist from Canada captured a photograph of the White Tower at dusk. When the picture was developed, a faint figure could be seen in one of the upper windows. A woman in Tudor dress, head bowed, the faint outline of a halo around her. Photographic experts called it a trick of light. But those who know the tower say that window belongs to a room that hasn't been used in nearly a century. Today, the Tower of London is one of Britain's most visited landmarks. Children point at the crown jewels. Couples take selfies beside the ravens. But when the gates close and the crowds vanish, the air grows still again, as it did 5 centuries ago. The guards still patrol with flashlights, now instead of lanterns. Yet the stories haven't changed. They say that if you walk the corridors between 2 and 3 in the morning, you'll hear her. First, the whisper of silk brushing stone. Then, the faint click of something rolling, a sound like bone against stone. And then, silence. A silence so deep you can hear your own blood in your ears. If you stay still, you might see a figure at the end of the hall, hovering in the dim light. Her gown faintly glowing, her head held high. Or perhaps she'll be standing right beside you, her breath brushing your neck, her voice soft and sad, asking the question she has asked for nearly 500 years. Why? And if you answer, they say she follows you home. Some claim she is not truly Anne Boleyn at all, but something older that took her shape, a fragment of grief left in the tower's stones. Others say she is the echo of all who died there, a single voice born from centuries of suffering. Whatever she is, she returns every May 19th, the anniversary of her death. At dawn, just before the sun rises, guards sometimes see her kneeling where the scaffold once stood. Her head is bowed, her hands folded in prayer. Then the light touches her, and she dissolves into mist. By full morning, the tower is bright and ordinary again, but the air remembers, And on quiet nights, when the wind carries the scent of roses and the sound of unseen footsteps crosses the courtyard, everyone who works there knows not to turn around. Because if you do, you might see her. Her gown moving without sound, her head tilted slightly to one side, and her eyes full of sorrow older than the stones themselves. They call her the Footless Ghost. But some guards whisper another name when the lights go out. They call her the Queen Who Still Waits. October 14th, 1977. London Underground. After the last southbound train, the station had finished breathing. That was how the night porters described it when the shutters rolled down and the last commuters were spilled up into the city like a tide withdrawing. The escalators hummed to a halt, the big fans wound down, the platform clocks blinked Siege and went blind. A hush settled that wasn't really silence at all, but a careful arrangement of small surviving sounds. The drip behind a locked service door, the metal tick of cooling rails, the faint sigh of a tunnel remembering trains. He stood alone on the platform and felt the temperature fall a single precise degree. Graham had been on nights 10 years. He knew the petty dramas of the underground after hours. Foxes in the cuttings, sleepers in the tunnels, teenagers daring each other to sprint the empty escalators. He had learned the difference between a draft and a presence, between a door settling and someone leaning on the other side. He wasn't afraid of the dark. Not exactly. He was afraid of the dark when it behaved. He had just finished his sweep. Torch over the benches, torch under the benches, call into the cleaner's cupboard to make sure no one had nodded off among the mops. When the tannoy clicked alive without a voice. A soft intake, like a throat about to speak. Then nothing. He told himself it was nothing, and scuffed his boot along the yellow line out of habit, feeling the grit and the rubber dust of brakes. Somewhere in the tunnel, half a mile of black curled like a sleeping animal. He thought of the advice that old Hans had given him when he started. Never whistle, never run, never stare into the tunnel longer than a count of 10. The place will start counting you back, an old linesman had said, with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. And you don't want that. At count 9, Graham's torch failed. Not sputtered, not dimmed, failed. A clean cut, as if a switch had been thrown just behind his heart. The platform lights still glowed their amber hush. His torch simply died. And in the instant his eyes adjusted, he saw it. On the far end of the platform, between the last poster panel and the tunnel mouth, a shape separated from shadow. It was lower than a man, broader in the shoulders. It moved with the slow grace of something that was not quite walking and not quite gliding. No sound of pads on tile, no claws. Just motion, dense as certainty, black as a blown fuse. He would swear later, and keep swearing it to men who had already heard it a dozen times and pretended not to, that the air pressed hard against his chest as if the station had inhaled and forgotten to let him go. He could not move. He did not want to. Fear organizes the body in the old ways. His hands remembered how to be small. The creature stopped at the lip of the yellow line and lifted its head. In that tilt, the vague became specific, a muzzle like damp velvet. Breath that ghosted the air without sound, ears pricking forward as if listening to a train that would never come. Its coat did not shine. It absorbed the light and gave back nothing. Its eyes were not eyes until they were. Two red coals, unflickering. The exact colour of brake dust in a torch beam and the hazard lights on a signal when a driver has already braked too late. He did not look into them. He looked at their edges, the way one glances at the sun and lets the eyelids take the damage. The creature stood with the patience of a monument. He could smell something he would later call sea cold, the mineral breath of chalk and iron and turned earth. He counted to 10 again, and then to 20 without meaning to, and by 30, the creature had moved. Not forward. It slid along the platform edge with a movement that produced no sign, as if the tiles themselves carried it. When it reached the tunnel mouth, it turned without turning, and where its paws should have touched the lip, there was a silence so total it made Graham's ears ring. Then it was gone. The pressure on his chest eased as if a hand had unclenched. He could breathe again. He could blink again. He did not speak of it for 3 nights. On the 4th, he found a note in the mess room, taped above the kettle, written in a careful biro hand. Do not look at its eyes. If it passes you, let it. If it stops, don't. No signature, no explanation. Just the rules as they had been passed down along the tracks, the way songs pass through cities, altered at the edges, true at the core. Stories accumulate in the underground like soot. They settle in layers. Roman rivers diverted. Plague pits disturbed by a new cutting. The wartime shelter where the lights failed, and the crowd breathed that one enormous single breath. And if you worked below long enough, you breathed them in too. There were older names for the thing Graham had seen. In pubs after the night shift, with dawn just beginning to pencil in the windows, the veteran drivers would lift their pints and say it without irony. Black Shock. The shock. The dog that walks when no one should. It was an East Anglian story once, a coastal apparition with sea-glow eyes and wet paws, a church door shadow that left scorch marks in pews. It had taken a job underground, it seemed. Maybe the tunnels felt like cliffs. Maybe the rails sang to it. Maybe things that are old and hungry look for places where the light is rationed. The shift rotated. The men changed platforms, changed stretches of line, changed their minds about the sensible way to explain what had happened. Some called it a trick of sodium bulbs and tiredness. Some said, big dog, and left it there, as if a big dog were the sort of thing that moved without sound and left frost on a man's tongue. Some began, without announcing it, to refuse the last walk of the platform when everything went truly quiet. Not the usual post-midnight quiet with cleaners and contract crews clanking, but the other quiet. The one that fell when the system itself seemed to decide it did not have to pretend for humans anymore. The quiet with edges. On nights like that, there were procedures. Sit in the lit bit. Keep the eyes down. Count, but don't count too far. If the tannoy clicked, and it would, sometimes, the harmless little click like a throat deciding whether to clear itself, you did not speak a cheerful, hello control, into it. You didn't speak at all. The voice that came back, when it came back, would be yours. Graham transferred stations, not because of fear, he told himself, because of career. He learned new corridors by their smells, old damp in a side tunnel where photographers like to trespass, hot metal near the traction room, the sweet rot of blown paper flowers from a memorial that had been removed above ground but felt more stubborn below. He learned the sound of a mouse skittering through crisp packets versus a shoe sole testing a forbidden staircase. He learned the way sound travels wrong in certain sections, how a footstep ahead of you can arrive behind you, how your breath in winter will bloom in front of your face in the still air, and someone else's breath will bloom beside it a beat later. And he learned, not by hearing, but by hearing it discussed during heavy-spirited tea breaks, the timetable of the shock. Not every night, not most. Often, around the turn of the autumn, the month of boilers clunking on, of commuters sniffling, of platform adverts showing beach holidays, as if the city had forgotten its own weather, the sightings increased, always after the last train, always on a platform with a yawning tunnel mouth that felt too close, sometimes on CCTV as a shadow that passed across the pixels with no corresponding human heat signature, sometimes in the eye line only, leaving the cameras indifferent, as if machines could refuse to acknowledge myth. There were deaths. There are always deaths in a system built of electricity and speed and inattention. No one formally connected the ones that came a few days after a sighting. No one put that in a report. But in the lift with the panel of emergency keys, in the smoking corner where the exhaust fans never quite cleared the fog, the men would count backward. How many shifts since the thing had been seen? How many nights since the silence had pressed down hard on the sternum? How many days until someone, a cleaner, a porter, a track walker, called in sick and never returned? I'm not saying it kills, a supervisor said. Not quite to the room. I'm saying it marks. There's a difference. No one likes to be marked. A cleaner named Asha told a story that made the room itself feel like it ought to stand up and leave. She'd been on the western end of a platform with a broom and a plastic bag that rasped when she shook it open. The tunnel breathed damp. The station clock flickered as if it were practicing insomnia. She saw it out of the corner of her eye first, which is to say she saw nothing, and her blood quickly informed her otherwise. The shadow where there ought not be a shadow, the gravity of it, the way her broom seemed not only lighter but unnecessary. She obeyed the rule of angles. Do not face what wants your face. She turned slightly so that her left eye could watch the gap between the far bench and the iron curve of the tunnel mouth in a coward's way. She saw the pause when they lifted. Not pause. Absence shaped like pause. She saw a tongue and a mouth that had too much night in it to be a mouth. And then she caught it, briefly, by accident. Its eyes. Not long, not enough to drown. But the pressure that rose up through her shins from the tiles was anyone's definition of drowning. The cold climbed her bones fast, shrewd. She thought of a memory she had not used in years. Being 8, the family's village well in summer, the air down there smelling of rock and frog skin. The same chill now, except inside the bones, a geology of cold. Asha had been a woman of laughter. She still was, mostly. But for 6 nights after that, she did not recognize the jokes people were making around her. She went home, and her husband asked if the job had become a burden, and she said no. Invoice shapes that belonged to someone far away. She dreamed of a platform with no exits, a bright white sign that said, way out in old enamel letters, and the arrow kept moving, flipping, pointing into the black. On the 7th day, she woke with the taste of soot in her mouth and sickness in her stomach, and told herself firmly that fate was a superstition. She went back down the next night. The station felt ordinary. She laughed like herself again and felt the bones that had been cold warm up from the inside. She did not tell anyone that when she entered sleep, something lay at the foot of her bed for a long, patient minute and then left. That would have sounded like believing. Not everyone thawed. A driver who joked in the mess that he'd stare it down. Bloody mutt. Hit the brakes too late on a morning run the following week. No one died, but no one laughed either. The station master wrote up the paperwork with hands that made tiny jerks in the loops of his letters. A CCTV operator who paused the footage where a shadow moved and enlarged it again and again and again until the pixels surrendered to meaning, took sick leave, and sent a message to the team. WhatsApp. Don't watch it as a shadow. Watch the spaces around it. That's where it is. The message deleted itself within an hour, and he never came back. It was not a suicide note. It was a caution, and the caution arrived too late to be useful to anyone who read it twice. There were theories. There are always theories. The rational ones arrived with clipboards and spoke of sound pressure changes in tunnels that create anxiety. The men around the tea table nodded gratefully for the gift of explanation and did not sit nearer to the tunnel mouth afterward. A historian came with a camera crew and talked, with impressive delicacy, about the stories of Black Shuck from the coast meeting the stories of the underground, the way legends migrate along the same tracks as labourers. He asked for interviews and received them, each man telling the same careful half story, the version that stops before the part where you feel the thing and the thing feels you. The cameras filmed the dust drifting in the light and didn't capture the moment the platform lights dimmed a fraction, as if a thought passed through the building. The historian asked his producer later if she'd felt it. She lied, kindly, because if you're going to sell a legend, you shouldn't have to carry it home in your throat. On certain nights, the system made music. Before the first train, the rails sang as heat found them. A thin, immaterial note that spiraled down the tunnel and threaded itself through the tiles. Those who had seen the shock learned to hate that note. It meant the rails could sing, and perhaps other things could answer. On other nights, the lights gave a single blink, and that was enough to make a man check his watch and then not check it again, for fear it would have stopped. On yet other nights, the tannoy coughed once and let a syllable slip in a voice that could have been anyone's. A name. Sometimes your own. If you ask the station painters, men who spent long hours with their heads tilted back replacing creamy rectangles of wall that had been scuffed into city grey by millions of brushes of cloth and flesh, they would tell you a painting story. How murals on disused platforms changed subtly over time without anyone touching them. How the eyes in painted faces seem sadder in November. How sometimes a blackness appears in the corner of a frame that had been white the week before. A little audience of shadow. Ask the escalator mechanics, and they would shrug. Because the escalators are honest machines. They break, they protest, they grind, they confess their ailments by smell and sound. Ask them if they have ever felt watched while half into an inspection hatch, their legs dangling over the metal teeth. They will either say no too quickly or yes too softly. Ask the platform announcers and they'll tell you in practical voices that the truly frightening thing is the way a crowd can decide to do something as one animal. Ask them again at 3 a.m, with the station empty, and a smile will twitch lower on one side. When it goes quiet, one will say, I check the mirrors. If there's something behind me in the mirror, I say his line. The next train is for the cemetery. He will laugh at his own joke and not again. None of this stops the trains. The city wakes, yawns, demands. The morning crowds pour back down the escalators like grains through a clock, and the platforms bright with newspapers and perfumes and songs from tinny headphones push the night back where it belongs like a curtain. Tourists read plaques that say, mind the gap, and smile at their own careful feet. Children peer into tunnels and make howling sounds to hear their voices come back funhouse-shaped. Lovers exchange quick kisses before parting for different lines and maybe never meeting again. The city's heart thrums on a million Oyster card taps, and down below, the air warms with breath and voltage. When you work nights, you know that all of that is a performance of daylight. You do not begrudge it. You are grateful for it, the way a diver is grateful for the surface. But you know there is a time after the metal shutters shake down, and the last drunks are coaxed towards stairs, and the cleaner's cart squeaks into its first lap when the station looks around and says, with the leisure of kings, now. That is the hour when the black shuck chooses, if it chooses. It prefers older stations. It likes disused platforms seen from newer ones, those dim spaces lit by ghostlight, where posters from a vanished decade peel in strips, and the tiled station name spells itself in a font that modern eyes almost remember. It is fond of curves. Those sections of track where the tunnel bends away like a throat swallowing and the rails vanish behind the wall. It rarely visits termini. It likes a through place, a between. If you meet it, and you may, though most souls will never suspect how close they have stood to that kind of oldness. The rules are the ones on the tea room note, and a few more learned by viscera. Do not call to it. It knows your voice already, and has no use for courtesy. Do not step back to the wall. The wall is a lie. Stand as you are, in the middle of the human you are. Do not count beyond 30. If you feel the counting continue without you, stop breathing for the length of 2 heartbeats, and the count will forget your name. If it passes you without stopping, you are not blessed. You are unchosen. Be grateful. If it stops, the pressure will rise in your chest until your ribs creak like old wood. You will think, this is what dying feels like. It is not. Dying is later. This is remembering. Above all, do not meet its eyes. If you do, it will lend you a week, a generous, exact week, and then come for what it bought with that eye contact. No one writes those rules on a wall. They are not in the training manual. They are told in kitchens at 4 a.m. with toast and damp coats on the back of chairs. They are told on smoke breaks when a man's lighter will not catch the first time. They are told in the breath before the lights are turned out and the keys turned in. Graham lasted another decade. Sometimes he felt it before it came. The way the platform air bowed in toward the tunnel. The way the rails went from metal to instrument. The way his own pulse slipped into someone else's tempo. Sometimes he did not feel anything at all, and there it was, already at the far end, already sliding toward the curve. A grace as terrible as a cathedral. One morning, after his last shift before retirement, he stood at the very top of the steps that carry night back into day and listened to the station yawn awake. He thought of telling the young porter at his side the whole thing, everything, not the half-tales, and did not, because he wanted the boy to have a month or 2 more of being unselected by knowledge. He pressed his locker key into the lad's hand and said something cheerful about football instead. He walked out into a London that had not decided its weather yet, and felt, as he crossed the street toward the bus stop, a weight lift he had not realized he'd been carrying since October of 1977, the awareness of the hour when sound becomes shape. He bought a paper. He bought a roll and did not finish it. On the bus, he fell asleep with his chin on his chest and woke to a dream of a platform where the only sign was a painted word, surface. The arrow pointed up and also down. He laughed, old and sudden, and the woman across from him smiled out of reflex, because laughter makes its own rules in a city. He did not tell his family about the shock. He did not warn them not to stare too long into the tunnel mouths on the days when the service stalled. He did not stop taking the tube. That would have been surrender and sentimentality, two things he could never afford. He learned to ride the first trains of the day, write with cleaners and school kids, and let the tunnels be black in the honest way.